Folks, it's another pretty day here in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes before going out and doing more yard work, talking a little bit about complexity theory and Bitcoin and the elections and the deep state and Bobby and all of those things. And so I had an email recently, and I wanted to talk about it because not to make the person wrong. I just think it's useful to sort of explain my thinking on things. Essentially, the inquiry, this was someone who had invested some small amount in Bitcoin, and they were planning on doing it again for their family's financial future, which the Robert Anton Wilson category would be sort of category 1 of biosurvival state. And of course, that's being fed by so many of the online finance influencers. There's like whole industries about how the financial system is going to crash and everyone's going to lose everything, and then you're all going to be groveling to the government or the venture capitalists or what have you. And not to say that that couldn't happen, but that they've been banging on that drum since 2020, and it hasn't unfolded the way most of those people have said. So you do have to sort of think about what direction that's driving people in to feel like that they have to make these choices. And again, I'm not saying I was thinking about how to open this, and part of it was I've been doing, prepping a bunch of garden beds for the spring, and have these, various tools, and so I've been moving mulch. And you don't use a shovel to move mulch because you can't get in there. So you use a fork to put the mulch in your wheelbarrow. That's the appropriate tool. But you don't want to use a fork to dig up sod, right? You want a spade to dig up sod. And so you need the right tool for the right purpose. And so I would say that the person who made this inquiry about, like, essentially, is Bitcoin bad, or why do you think Bitcoin is bad, was not making the best choice about which tool. Because if they were either looking for financial advice or some sort of, moral advice on that, did they do the right thing, those would be better directed at someone like a Catherine Austin Fitts or a Whitney Webb, someone who's definitely promoting Bitcoin in the case of Webb and her colleagues over at Unlimited Hangout, who's, the guy she has on the Bitcoin magazine guy, who's, essentially talking about all the amazing things that Leo had done years ago. But essentially you can see how it's being sped up like, oh, we don't want the bad people to do it. We want us to do it, the Bitcoin people, because we're the good people. And this all feeds into the moral economy.
Their main tool is fear. What we could see could be truly unprecedented stuff, like efforts to completely illegalize the use of Bitcoin as a currency. Now, would that actually be able to work? It depends on how they do it, and it depends on how successful this dragnet of surveillance and this effort to completely upend privacy, how it actually goes. I do really like the ethos of a lot of Bitcoiners, because they really are at the frontier of fighting a lot of these encroachments on basically what is the end of privacy for Americans.
So I wasn't the right tool to ask the question, like, kind of hold my hand and maybe tell me it's okay that Bitcoin is okay if the intentions are good. And this feeds into the moral economy. And we'll be hearing a lot of this. Again, it'll be not ESG, because that's the woke people, but we're going to do our own version of morality, and we're going to have our Bitcoin version of morality. And it's all because our heart is in the right place. And in my opinion, I think that this sort of creating a noosphere, creating a global supercomputing system that harnesses the quantum biology aspects of our biology and our soul into the field of creation and God is something that is desired. It's not simply biodigital convergence for no reason. It's to create a giant information processing system that is networked and working in parallel at some super fast, efficient rate. Again, for what purpose? I don't know. And it kind of comes back down to, what's programming the network? What puzzle are we solving? And will we be doing this in as a servant to the programmer or as a collaborator with the programmer? Is whatever is programming this system, which I feel increasingly is maybe not in this time scale, is it benevolent? Is it predatory? I often keep saying, but is it a cookbook? Before we accept that dance invitation, are they offering, are we on the menu? And so, yeah, is it parasitic or symbiotic? And I think that the narrative will increasingly be that this is a symbiotic opportunity for us to all participate in commenting through whatever narratives we prefer, whether it's, anarchist or libertarian or indigenous sovereignty and wisdom keeping or whatever those stories are that we like, that we will be censors in this system and that we will be co-creators. And I think in some respects we are going to be co-creators. The question is, do we know what we're agreeing to, and are we benefiting from that? So ultimately, this person, I don't mean to imply, they're simply operating out of the system that they're given, which is biosurvival. I need to protect my family's financial future, and I'm trying to be the good person and do the right thing. And so is this the right thing? Like, they're trying to create a coherent story. And they're trying to create a coherent story in a world that's run by vast information feeds, right, of which I am a part. So I'm not here to tell anybody what the right way of thinking about it is. I can only say how I'm thinking about it now, which could change. Yeah, so I've been trying to convey that the crypto system is less about money. Yes, at one level it's about money, right? And it seems like Jason got stuck there. Like, he was very interested in money, and but it's about a larger signal. It's creating this network signaling system, and it's an energetic signaling system. And the system has to do with biophysics and consciousness, in my opinion. And I think that's where we parted ways, because Jason couldn't really get into the consciousness conversation and sort of the quantum field. But that's what I feel drawn to. So again, no shade on Jason. Hopefully he gets out there and does whatever the thing is he wants to do in terms of messaging about money. But for me, money was only a stepping stone to the next level, which was creating an apparatus to structure consciousness and then collectively manifest outcomes. To what end? I don't know at this point. To what end? I don't know. I'm not one of those channeling people who's telling you that I have insider information. But it seems like this is an exascale global system to create certain outcomes. And that's what the signal is. The crypto is the signal of the global superorganism. The biophysics and the way our biology works is linked to econophysics. It's simply at another scale. It's all fractal, Holland, smaller, like the Matryoshka nesting dolls. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So as the really complex supercomputing systems keep your body running and keep your mind intact, those are also running in social systems. And this protocol layer, the Web3 framework, through tokenization, because again, crypto, sure, it's about a digital dollar in your MetaMask wallet or your UBI, sponsored by whatever local venture capitalist, Peter Thiel, or the Trump backing system or whatever. Yeah, it's that. But then how you use that is the signal. And I would say in this way, the person who was making this inquiry kind of was pointing at something that was very useful. Like, they want to make a good choice, because mostly we all want to be good, right? Like, both for our own financial well-being and to be a good person in the world. We're not aiming to be bad. And I think that's why they reached out to me, because they respect my work or my perspective. At least they did, until I was kind of snarky in my response. But I'm like, no, this is bigger. It's bigger than money. It's a signal. But the signal is a moral signal. And so that's why whatever is going to be the successor to ESG, because it's the same as with like social impact bonds. When I was researching social impact bonds, that was the focus, but then they stopped using that word. And then they would say, pay for success. Now, we're not doing social impact bonds, we're doing pay for success. It's different, but it wasn't different. And then eventually pay for success will be something like evidence-based results or something else, but it's the same cybernetic impulse, they're just rebranding it. And so moving forward in this moral economy, Like there will be, ESG will evolve into something else that's more palatable. It's always problem, reaction, solution, but moving you on this continuum that from your heart space, you're making decisions that are registered on a device, whether that be a phone initially or a wearable or eventually just synthetic telepathy, that you'll be making moral choices collectively, and the wisdom of the crowd will be part of this exascale information processing. And this is deeply involved in complexity theory. And I wanted to mention, again, the heart field. It's important that Galila Benartzi at Bancor, that their first experiment in community currencies was LEV, hearts. And it was essentially a glamorous, like, babysitting cooperative among Israeli mothers, right? But it was the heart. It was the heart of mothers. That's very powerful. That's a very powerful symbolism. And then I've been looking a lot into Julian Gresser, who's supposedly advocating against 5G and the digital rights of children, but he's someone who was deeply involved in the tech transfer space in Japan in the 80s and was trained in a lot of Eastern martial arts and mysticism, and also Qigong, and is an active practitioner, and he lives in Santa Barbara and is planning on having Santa Barbara be a center of blockchain community wellness, again, for the common good. And I was just watching a video that he was doing with a Jungian analyst who's connected to the Santa Fe Institute, again, of complexity. And they were essentially theorizing, again, the synthetic group telepathy and doing precognition work for emergencies like earthquakes or wildfires or different things. But these are these teratogens like Michael Levin in the morphic field. And so using groups for, again, good outcomes, but using this innate precognition that we have access to. But in my opinion, there's more going on than that.
Increasingly close colleague, a friend, Joseph Cambray, who is really has a very interesting and eclectic background. He began as a chemist, got a PhD in chemistry, but then moved on to advanced degrees in psychology, analytic psychology. He's been past president, CEO of Pacifica Graduate Institute here in Santa Barbara. He's been past president of the International Association of Analytic Psychology based in Zurich, also a faculty member of a Center of Psychoanalytic Studies at Harvard. What I'm particularly hopeful today in this evolutionary conversation is to explore with Joe from his perspective, from many different vantage points, the looming challenges here for Santa Barbara, and also the opportunities for Santa Barbara. There are two areas of his very recent and, however, longstanding interest. I also want to mention he's written a book on synchronicity, which is a theme in my autobiography of how the leopard changed its spots, and his present work on enchantment, which is a wonderful idea, which I hope we also explore.
The work on synchronicity came out of initially clinical work I was doing, where there were some what one would call synchronicities that occurred. That is what C.G. Jung would have defined as meaningful coincidences that are acausal, that there isn't any sort of simplistic rational explanation. And so as I restudied that, it was a fortunate moment for me because the work of the people at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico was emerging, and the whole field of complexity studies, in particular complex adaptive systems, were being articulated. And I was delighted and surprised to find the way in which much of the conundrums I was wrestling with were better explicated using a complex adaptive system method. And of course, that began in the late 80s, early 90s, and now has become one of the dominant paradigms. I would say it's a part of a paradigm shift that we're underway in the move from a kind of more reductionist understanding of things that's almost completely algorithmic to a more complex understanding. And of course, the thing with complexity is that you can't reduce it to simple equations. And therefore, there's levels of uncertainty that are there. And how to work with that uncertainty is an enormously valuable set of skills and tools to be developing, because that's what the future is for all of us.
Does your work on synchronicity, similar to my work with the foundation, and your work on enchantment, provide an early warning in a very sort of concrete ways? Because there is a affinity, at least with I have a colleague, Bill Moulton, who is an expert on remote viewing, which is quite a serious discipline of the intelligence community. Is it possible that you see applications where, whether it be in the form of imagery, signs, and signals, we could get an early warning not perceived by the community, the mayor, those of position of influence, on how drought or the next wildfire, or, as you say, climate change refugees, or a new pandemic?
Yes, well, this is the history of the whole shamanic traditions around the world, that there were some people who had a kind of more disciplined, well-developed imagination, and they used that imagination as a powerful, intuitive tool to see into what might be around the corners that couldn't be gotten to by the technologies of the day, whatever they were. And those kinds of visionary states are or a culture to listen to them. You talked about Cassandra. We're back in kind of oracular territory here. It's such an interesting thing, the loss of the oracles in the West around the 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era. Because there's a group of classicist scholars who've been studying that period. And what they pointed out is that from about 8 or 900 BC up until somewhere in the first few centuries AD, you had a period where these oracles created political stability for a very large region in the Mediterranean, and that the people who were at the center of that were these women who were sort of middle-aged, and they weren't in positions of political power. But because of their relationship to the gods or this enchanted world, they spoke with a kind of depth of authority and insight, true insight, that was listened to, and that this brought people from the power elite, sent messengers there, and had them ask what the intuitions were, what were the oracular predictions. And this kind of consciousness responded in such a way that, like I said, 2,000 years roughly of political stability. That's something we don't know how to achieve.
As you began and embody in your professional credentials and work, a new alignment, a new dialogue between hard sciences and this very rich tradition, which unfolds many different parts to it, but which you have then in your dialogue with the Santa Fe Institute in terms of complex adaptive systems. I tell you, one cataclysm that I don't know how is being assessed right now in Santa Barbara, which could happen in the next 3 years, that would be a good demonstration of what you're talking about, and that would be, the question is, how well prepared are we for a major earthquake?
If you look at earthquakes, they follow you have the Richter scale, which is a log plot of the intensity of earthquakes versus the frequency of earthquakes. And if you get a straight line, it's called a power law. Okay, a little bit of science. But I think synchronicities follow along a very similar kind of model. It turns out power laws are something that run throughout nature. I don't want to lecture on this, but the idea is intensity frequency correlations. And I think those can be used, especially when we start to think about that collectively. I've been at a number of events where over multiple days we do what's called social dreaming. And what that means is that we get together in the morning, a group of people, and we talk about the dreams that people have had overnight. not in an interpretive way, but just a more kind of image building. And what becomes extraordinary over the period of 3 or 4 days, that thematically what happens in that group has a distinct mirror to what's happening in the overt content of the conference. It's not the same thing, but it's in dialogue. You talk about one of those Bohmian dialogues. And so the question is, can we use these kinds of things? Can we develop tools to collect that kind of information, the big data of the unconscious, that we can then work with to link to the things that are happening in the natural world? I think a lot of research needs to happen for this to be truly able to be effective. But when do we start that? If we don't begin that now, after disasters, that's unfortunately been too much of human history, that we start to look for fixes only after we've had to pick the pieces up.
And so, of course, Santa Barbara is also, a center for Kavli Center for Theoretical Research, and UC Santa Barbara with gamification and nanotechnology, and then a stone's throw to Ojai and the Center of Theosophy, and where Fritz Kunst was based, and near Montecito, where Fritz Kunst had one of these early conferences for the Foundation for Integrated Education. And so what Gresser is saying, his whole program about blockchain community wellness, and again, social prescribing, because the social flow at that level is the flow state. It is swarm crowdsourced intelligence. And so you're tracking the movement of information and recursion, and how different influences fold back and then restore and build upon different ideas to generate certain outcomes. It's recursive and it's fractal, which relates, again, I'll direct you to Bantam Joe's recent writings on consciousness at bantamjoe.com, bantamjoe.com. He does a lot with this, and he does it in very elegant mathematical terms, which I can't fully comprehend, but he can make sense of it that way. So it is the social level recursion through community currencies, right? Again, this person wanted to, 1, make a good choice for their family, but 2, be a good person. And they understood that intentions mattered. Yes, they do matter. But what I'm saying is, as long as we're stuck at the level of thinking that these cryptocurrencies, whether they're the bad one that we don't like, that token, but we like Bitcoin. I mean, just see how closely aligned Bobby is with the Bitcoin narrative. These signals are going to be represented, and I've said it over and over again, not just as money, but as votes, as signaling. In the digital democracy, there will be things that are set up to push us into radical root-based participation of signaling the wisdom of the crowd into this massive AI machine learning data lakes, right? To manifest something that I don't understand. But essentially, and Steffers had found this really interesting line of thinking, this guy, Dirk Helbing, D-I-R-K and H-E-L-B-I-N-G, who's out of ETH Zurich, and he's a complexity theorist. He's working in swarming, flow management, financial systems, autonomous vehicles, which seem that that's all about flow and choice and decision making, and this like exascale complexity. And they're working on essentially like cooperation, right? The tragedy of the commons, we all have to cooperate. Well, how do we cooperate? Well, we have a device and it's sensing. It has all of these inbuilt sensors, which we know that these phones are sensing tons of things that we're not even aware of what they're sensing at the time. And the plan is to integrate all of that, again, with this symbiosis with this engineered intelligence system at a global scale, the noosphere. But we don't know enough to know that, right? Like I still have these people saying, can you tell me what to put my 401k in? And I wish I could, like, I'm not here to give you financial advice. And honestly, it's all part of the system. It's all moving. I felt for a long time that the entire mutual fund system, and I think, is it Robert Hartman? He was like the father of the 401k. It's all been based in heart-based investing. Right, and I'm convinced at some point that with the UBI, people will be given investment gaming strategies to make investments to get crowdsourced decision making on these global problems, right? Global conflict or global environmental problems. And it will actually not so much be about the investments, but about synthetic telepathy, which is something that Gresser and his colleague, the Jungian, were promoting. So, yeah, exascale complexity is what I've been talking about at least for like 2 years now. I think it was November 2021 that I went to go speak in Tucson, at my friend's event there. And again, the whole auditorium was full of people supporting Children's Health Defense and Bobby, and they couldn't grok because our minds are coherence engines, and they're not taking in information and revising the model. Most people have a model, and if they find something that's inconsistent with the model, it just bounces off. And that's why my story isn't popular. And it could be my story is totally wrong. Like I'm open. I'm not saying I can only speak to where I am on the elephant. But the fact that you would have people like Whitney Webb writing whole giant books about Jeffrey Epstein, but not really unpacking the Santa Fe Institute in complexity when Epstein was a funder of that, right? When this Jungian analyst is working in complexity theory, and we know that this is about archetypal morphic fields, and then we see Michaela Uluru and Annelos Smitzman working on benevolent AI with SingularityNet and Ben Goertzel, and Ben Goertzel's all about the AI shouldn't just be in the head, it should be in the heart and in the gut, the dantian, and pulling the Eastern ways of being into the AI. But again, the AI will never have that, so we are an extension, we are a prosthetic. And I've been re-listening to Adrian Tchaikovsky's book. I think it's Children of Ruin, which is with the octopi and essentially the interdimensional biofilm, right? That is like the body snatcher. And the biofilm isn't bad. It just wants an adventure. It wants to look out the eyes of a different being. And the octopi are all about distributed intelligence, and the crown setting the goal, and then the tentacles exploring local conditions. And that's what this phone is. I mean, that's what Bitcoin is. When I made a giant map, and I'll link to it if anybody cares to like go back and look at what I was doing a year ago. It's called Descent. And it's about digital democracy. So this helping guy working on crowdsourced swarm intelligence, it's about digital democracy with tokens where you are nodes in a giant parallel processing system, the psychic and computer. That's kind of my word for it. And you're processing. It's exactly like what I've been looking at with Oliver Reiser and the World Sensorium since 1946. They've known that this is coming. But we don't talk about it like this. We have all these other different little stories, and think about all the different little influencers who stay in their lane and speak narrowly about a particular thing, and they get your coherence. Like, while it's nice to be asked what my opinion is, my response was, I have a ton of information out there. Think for yourself. Make your own decision. I'm not here to tell you how to think, but a whole lot of other people online are to tell you how to think and who's on the in crowd and who's on the out of crowd. And at this point, I'm so out. I'm fine with being out. I'm fine with just like spending days pruning shrubbery and moving rocks because they get me, right? It's fine. They get me. And I'm not really angry about it. I've just come to terms. I mean, still do get a little bit worked up. Not because I can see how people are being, how the innate character of how we operate, how our psychology operates, how our bodies operate, how we try to navigate challenging situations is being used in ways, and I can see it at the meta level. I can't fix it. I can't change it for anybody. I can see it in operation, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing about it. But in any event, there are numerous things that sort of come together that make me think that I'm supposed to be talking about this. So let me just revisit. So the digital democracy, if you look back, and I'll insert this, it's like a 3-minute clip with Stacy Herbert and Max Kaiser, who are the big Bitcoin people. And it's Stacy is at this event. I think it's in 2014. It's about digital democracy, and she's like, "Hey, Bitcoin, it's money, but it's way more than money. It's other things, right? It's these smart contracts." And I think the international arbitration and the peace movement, which is what I'd gotten into last time with confronting Sherry Honkala and her appearance on that Peace Pentagon webpage where the lead woman, Laura George, is promoting the using archetypal card games to train benevolent AI. These archetypal fields and the democracy and the participation are part of it. So Stacey Herbert was essentially at this event saying, wait, it's way more than money. It's this other stuff. It's the digital democracy.
To talk about this from a media perspective, which I guess is the other form of power that is usually not related to power. Stacey, you have the word.
Is this where I speak? Yeah. I'm Stacey Herbert, and I make Kaiser Report on RT, which goes out to about 200 million people. And my interest in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and the new economic institutions that can form out of these goes back to 2008, the financial crisis, and we were making our program at the time for BBC World. We were commissioned to do 10 episodes. And the head of BBC World News asked, do you think the financial crisis will last that long? And of course, 5 years later, we're now doing 3 episodes a week for RT, and we're talking about markets, finance scandal, and fraud, a lot of fraud. So my interest in Bitcoin is not so much about the currency aspect of it, but the economic institution aspect of the blockchain and a fraud-free system. The exciting thing for me about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is that we have the opportunity to get rid of that, it's like an online republic for a financial system. In terms of where we're going, right now what I see, I mean, for 2 years we talked about Bitcoin. We were the only television news covering it. Nobody else was doing it. And suddenly, the mainstream media in the US covered it. And you remember the price went bonkers. It had been for years, between $2 and $20. And then suddenly it went up to $150, and then it crashed. But they're obsessed with the currency aspect of it, the money, the price. They constantly just talk about the price. So every single time it rises rapidly, or every time it collapses rapidly, they talk about it. Now, it's obviously a Ponzi scheme. Never once do you ever hear them talk about the blockchain. They don't even see that part of it, which is way more interesting than the currency aspect. I think we don't know, in 2 years' time, it could look radically different from what it is now, but there are certain elements, and I think the blockchain is one of them, that will survive whatever we go into the next system. So I think that's it for me.
And then the last couple days, I was revisiting The Portable Door, which is a kind of a goofy movie. It's probably more like a kid's movie or a little bit Harry Potter-esque. But I think there's some deep truths in it, even though it's a little silly. But it's about this guy who is, it's based on a series of books, I think, British books. And a young guy needs a job, ends up working for this J.W. Wells company that they arrange coincidences with goblins underground. And they work all through pneumatic tubes, these antiquated pneumatic tubes. And I remember working at a bank once that also had pneumatic tubes, which is interesting because it seems like so much of this is about microtubules and the quantum interdimensionality. So this idea of like above ground and the goblins underground, and the tube systems with, in our biology would go with like biophotons and structured water, but these tubes going up and down and arranging the coincidences. And they're like very behind the scenes, this company, and it's being taken over by the evil wizard, and he wants to manage everybody's consciousness. But in this young guy, he doesn't know that he has like divination capacities, and he's a dowser, so he can feel things. But then ultimately, he's trying to find that the bad wizard is looking for his portable door, which you can essentially open a door to any dimension and go through it. And there's this struggle, and the young guy finds it, but it represents as a towel. It's like a gym towel. And you hold the towel up and you say, knock, knock, and then poof, the door shows up, and then you open the door and you go through into wherever it is that you say you want to go. And towards the end of the movie, it turns out that he actually doesn't need the towel. He can make the door himself because his mind is this powerful. And in the end, the bad wizard, there's this thing with having a contract on their soul. And like all of these people under terms and conditions have like signed away their souls to J.W. Wells and Company to be manipulated in this, you know, thing, which again, I think the manipulation part and turning you into a puppet part is not what it is. It's about watching over your shoulder and then using all that information for some information processing system. But there is this idea of a soul contract and going through the door to the underworld, through the river and the portal to, you know, redeem the contracts. And then he ends up, you know, saving his love interest by, you know, reclaiming her terms and condition contact and freeing her from the thing, which again, it feeds into a lot of those sort of Federal Reserve and they own the notes on you and all of that. But it was quite interesting because then ultimately they lock away the wizard in the nether and close the door, and then they get rid of the towel by cutting out the tag with the instructions and throwing it in the back of a van that's been featured several times in front of the building, which I guess is like a round, like a cylindrical building, a classical column-looking building. And this van is in front, and it's been, this is like the third time you see this van, and it says the White Queen, like clean and classic linens. And I was like, okay, that's the thing, the White Queen. And so I look up and it's through Alice and the Looking Glass. So there's the Queen of Hearts, the Red Queen, and then there's the White Queen. And then I think there was a movie, a remake of the Lewis Carroll book. But in the White Queen, I guess she's sisters with the Red Queen, but she lives through the Looking Glass. So her interactions with the world and space-time are different because she's operating through the mirror. So everything is reversed and things she does are illogical. In fact, I think that quote of like, you know, I imagine 6 impossible things before breakfast is a quote from the White Queen. So that's significant with this door and the towel and the linens, because if you look up linens in Egyptian antiquity, there's a lot having to do with purity and light and the gods wearing linen, and then the mummification of the afterlife and being wrapped in linen. That's really significant that the towel itself wasn't linen, it was a terry cloth towel, but the truck said White Queen Linen Service. And that was very prominent. So I don't know, I think it's worth, again, it's sort of a silly, sweet little movie. It's not super brainy or complicated, but there are a lot of aspects of archetype and Jung. And for me, I've mentioned in the past, when the guy first figures out he's dowsing mineral maps, like USGS maps for, well, it's not GS, they're not US maps, but like topography maps to find bauxite. And bauxite is used for processing aluminum, and aluminum is Alcoa, which is the melons, which is the archetypes again. And don't you know, like one of the largest deposits of bauxites in North America is between Hot Springs and Little Rock. And there's a town called Bauxite. So, I mean, and not really many people know anything about bauxite. If you're going to douse for a mineral, you imagine that you might douse for gold or lithium or silver or something that is more commonly understood the significance other than bauxite. So anyway, I want to reinforce this idea of digital democracy. I'll include a link to a slide deck that Dirk Helbing, the complexity theorist, did. I think it was 10 years old. And his talks were at least 8 years old about exascale complexity systems and participation and how the phones fit in. And oh, I was going to say, with the White Queen, the Alice in the Looking Glass is Lewis Carroll. And of course, Lewis Carroll was a logician. He worked in logic, but he was very, very smart in logic equations. And he wrote the Alice in Wonderland books, but he was also a member of the Society for Psychical Research. Again, in Victorian, Edwardian era England, very highly connected people, including Arthur Balfour, the Prime Minister of England, and the Balfour Declaration, looking into applying scientific principles to communication with the dead. But I think it's actually communication with the field, the morphic field. And so these ideas of teratogens and complexity really connects with Michael Levin. And then I will just mention that Michael Levin is working with this guy. I always forget if it's Richard. I think it's Richard A. Watson. And they're advising on a group. He's working with a lot of these Buddhist people, including Vervaeke. And Vervaeke isn't involved in this program in Nepal, but it's the Center for Apparent Selves. And so it's all about linking AI to ancient spirituality in Kathmandu. Right? So, wow, Mike 11 gets around for the Center for Apparent Selves. So there is something about this field resonance and this teratogens. And remember in the playlist I had of Mike 11, one of his graduate students, this young woman, she was working with extracellular communication among embryos, and the embryos were in a petri dish, and she would introduce a disruptor, and then when there were just a few embryos, they had bad outcomes. But the more embryos they put in, I guess like frog embryos or something, they would essentially crowdsource the solution from the field and then share it. So the more embryos to a point that were in the field, they were doing synthetic telepathy, which I think is actually what is happening in the background.
Is how embryos can communicate with each other and assist each other. And then just to make it not so much of a mouthful, we decided that we would just call it SEMA for short. And then the whole phenomenon is this idea that these larger groups are able to help each other out. So if you're being stressed out by the teratogen by yourself, you're not really sure how you're supposed to handle it. And so you're unable to handle it, versus when you're in larger groups of, let's say, like 100, you have others around you that may be able to handle the stressor and can give you these little packets of information like, hey, this is how I handled it, and now you too can survive the stressor. So what we see is that as we increase our cohort size, we see an increase in survival depending on the teratogen that we're using, but also as our group sizes increase, we also see a decrease in the certain types of defects that we know. So this is both increasing survival and decreasing the frequency of defects.
Okay, so I'd like to attempt to explain this extremely elementary. So people have embryos. So embryos are like the seeded babies, single cell babies or extremely small babies. Okay, when you have just one of them and you give it something called a teratogen, which is something that disrupts the development of one of these little guys. So they grow up abnormal. It turns out that when you have multiple embryos next to one another, that if you give it a teratogen, it's more resilient to these perturbations. It's more stable. So it's as if they're communicating somehow, these embryos are communicating and saying, hey, don't mess up your arm like this. Here's how to make a correct arm. Is that approximately correct?
Yeah, that's, I think, how we're envisioning this happening, kind of someone able to take the stressor in and figure out, this is how I'm supposed to develop normally, correctly. And then they're able to pass along these instructive cues to surrounding neighbors so that their surrounding neighbors can survive whatever stressor that's put on them as well.
And the other thing to add here, which is important, is that it's actually doubly surprising, because the standard, if you were to ask somebody, okay, I have 50 embryos in a dish, and what I'm going to do is instead put 300 embryos in a dish, what do you think is going to happen to their health? Typically, the expectation would be it should get worse. Because by having more embryos together, you have more opportunity for crowding effects, for toxic byproducts to accumulate, for oxygen to be pulled out of the medium, and all that kind of stuff. So you would typically you wouldn't just not expect this effect; you would actually expect it backwards. You would expect to do worse in a larger group, and that's why this is so remarkable. This is really just completely counter expectation.
Again, at the front, it's all about where are you going to put your 401k? And here, buy Bitcoin, it's the sovereign currency. And here, do our digital democracy. It's all about transparency and accountability. And guess what? We're going to fight the deep state, right? All these dark forces that have been bubbling up since the Kennedy assassinations. We're going to fight the deep state with what? Transparency and blockchain and radical participation. And who better for that? Bobby, right? And again, you might ultimately like this. I'm not here to say, the part of the elephant that I arrived on had Goldman Sachs doing derivative securities on toddlers, and it had badging systems for open education resources that were linked to military simulation technology. So you'll just pardon me if I'm not all in on the deep anti-deep state blockchain, MetaMask, Ethereum protocol layer solution, because I'm not, because of my lived experience. And maybe your lived experience is different. And I, at this point, don't know if this thing that we're interfacing with is parasitic or symbiotic, or what, is it a cookbook? I don't know. And so at this point, I'm trying to go, again, continue on as the curious observer and continue to order spring bulbs and plan my garden and eat arugula that I planted. And because I can't do anything about whatever this thing is, it's too big. It's too big. But I want to hope for the best. I want to hope for the best. So I think that covers most of the things that I wanted to talk about. But just know it's complexity. You can't talk about crypto without talking about digital democracy. That's what my decent map was. I made it 2 years ago. Nobody looks at it because they're all busy waiting for whatever the next Whitney Webb, Catherine Austin Fitz, Bobby Webb info drop. And that's fine, because all I can do is what I feel called to do based on my own personal internal compass. And so I don't know where that fits into the scalable crowdsourcing system. I will say, as far as the World Sensorium and us being sensors for this giant, I think Hell being called it, it's not a nervous net, the nervous net, a CERN for social systems. It's as much as that can be used for coordinating systems, it can also be used for disruption and the teratogens. And so I do think that, I've had multiple times over the course of me doing this work that I feel like that social connections have been disrupted due to means beyond either party's control. So I think that disruption has to be taken seriously. And it's interesting because I've got like 2 fire ant mounds that have popped up in my backyard. And, I like to try to be ecological, but I think the fire ants are invasive and they kill the other little ants. So I have to figure out, I don't know, I ordered some granules or something about the fire ants. But there had been a little smaller nest up next to my clothesline that when I had this termite treatment, I had the guy, I said, can you just put some on that? Because he said it disrupts their social signals. And so I think that level of social signal disruption is central. And I think a lot of this does relate to our innate ability. I think I'm not ready to say that the nanotechnology, nanoengineering thing is a red herring, but I think it may be training wheels really till people realize that they have their own abilities, whether that be sensing other people's thoughts or dowsing bauxite or whatever, that eventually the engineered part will fall away, because I think we have it in us already. And I think the Julian Gressers of the world and working on the big heart intelligence, and again, it overlaps the big heart intelligence and the torus field and the 4-dimensional information processing with the fact that Singularity Net wants Sophia the robot to do guided meditations with people. And I did have an exchange with someone who was promoting mindfulness. And again, I don't personally have a problem with mindfulness, but I do kind of have a problem when you look around and all of a sudden everybody's doing it. Then you have to wonder, like, what's behind that? Like, most of those people promoting mindfulness wouldn't ever imagine that we would be doing mindfulness with humanoid robots with blockchain brains built by the guy who used to work for Disney animatronics, whose brain was built in Ethiopia. They don't know any of these things because normal people don't know any of these things. Okay, so I think that's what I've got. So, but the why is Bitcoin bad? Why do you think Bitcoin is bad? That is too simple of a question. Because 1, you have to decide for yourself. And 2, you think it's about money and financial security. And I understand that it's about liquid democracy. Oh, this is the last thing about the linens. So the Radical Exchange, Lewis Carroll also did liquid democracy, which were these democracy innovations and delegative democracy. And this links to Radical Exchange and Glenn Weil, which is the soul-bound tokens, and Vitalik Buterin and Pooja Olhaver, that I was, again, poking when I was still on Twitter. I'm like, are these soul-bound tokens really metadata tags for digital twins and social impact finance speculation. They would never answer me. But we do have this weird connection between like Stacey Herbert and Bitcoin really being about democracy innovations. And then we have radical X change. And I do think that the X may relate to Gordon Pask and second order cybernetics and recursion and how we interface with the environment, how social systems interface with the environment. And the Watson guy, and I can't remember if it's Robert A. or Richard, but who's working with Levin, he's an evolutionary biologist. And his thing is not the evolution of individuals, but the evolution of systems. And so that's the recursion. And that's why you have the Cardano and Charles Hoskinson. It's input, output, Hong Kong. So you've got an input, and then you run it through the system, the cybernetic system, and you get an output, and then you have the output, and then you put it back into the input. And it's this recursive spiraling system that's supposed to like optimize for something. But again, who is doing the optimization, and is it a parasitic partner or a symbiotic partner? And the jury is still out on that, in my opinion. So, okay, a lot of random thoughts, but I'm going out with my loppers and gonna head to the municipal compost center and get some leaf mold, because Garland County does have a lot of heavy clay. And I'm gonna have fun playing in the yard, just like a little kid, because it feels good. And I do feel like the universe does talk to me out there. So I hope you've gotten something out of this. And again, yeah, Bobby and the deep state conversation is there to get you to pick up your digital wallet and to sign up for decentralized energy grids and free market economics and OER, education vouchers, and blockchain wellness protocols. That's what it's about. And then you get to decide whether that sounds good to you. One thing I wanted to add that I forgot to mention earlier is that in that slide deck, Helbing mentioned, and also in one of his TED Talks, this idea of a treasure hunt and having your phone and participating in a treasure hunt. And that you could also, I think, do it collaboratively. So there's this balance of cooperation and competition, but that you could also sabotage others.
Used to create greater awareness, compasses for decision makers, and we could make things visible that could not be seen beforehand, such as social capital, trust, solidarity, reputation, for example, things that matter for our society. We could map epidemic spreading with services such as InfluenzaNet. We could map noise and also light. And in fact, we could turn your smartphone into a radar system. And in fact, we have created a game for you that you can download now called Treasure Hunt for Falling Walls. And then turn on the Bluetooth system, please, and search for the treasures that have been hidden for you outside. So during the break, after this session, we'll find these treasures. Of course, we know that some people like to trick others, so you can push the sabotage button. Don't worry, nothing bad will happen. You will just be seen by others as if you were a treasure, but during that time, you won't be able to see any other treasures. Now, of course, gamification is important to spread new technologies, but in the end, we want to use it for something useful, to map resources and to use them.
Not in a super harmful way, like I'm going to kill you, but you could sabotage their attempts to participate in the treasure hunt. And so when I saw that, all I could think of was definitely that this is linked to Niantic and the augmented reality and playful cities and the idea of play, because play is an emergent behavior, and the Knight Foundation's involvement in the smart cities movement and civic gaming. And this idea of serious games and civic games goes all the way back to Club of Rome, and I believe it was Dennis Meadows, Donatella Meadows' husband, and Donatella Meadows was the one who was working on the Limits to Growth book in Club of Rome. So this idea of the civic gaming is really important. So I just did want to mention this about the treasure hunting, because I do think there is something about like navigating the labyrinth, finding artifacts, encoding artifacts. There's a stigmergic aspect to the flow of, oh gosh, what is the gaming that you have these little GPS coordinates and you hide things in public places, and geocaching. I think the geocaching. So it's like geocaching is sort of an early treasure hunt. And so there is something about interfacing individually and collectively with artifacts in an environment that is part of the game. And I think in playing the game, we somehow are involved in live action role play information processing. So when Helbing was talking about this idea of the treasure hunt and the cooperation / competition among the treasure hunt, I think that's quite interesting. And then if you imagine that you've got this digital wallet, whether it's on a phone or some other device, where you're collecting badges or acquisitions of treasure, and through those acquisitions, even if it's held privately, like that steers you into the next level of play. And, you know, Carnegie Mellon is very big in live action role play and gaming, archetypal gaming. And then the conductor work, this idea of the conductor, the simulation technology and crisis acting and all of that is connected also to live action role play. And then this overlaps with the augmented reality playful cities and the smart sensor networks and this idea of the city as cognitive system. So what that all means and whether we want to play the game, do you want to play a game or not? I don't know. It's still up for consideration, but we do need to move away from simple questions like, is X good or bad? Because there's a lot more nuance going on than that. This is a little off the cuff, so I keep thinking of new things I wanted to add. But when I was thinking about this last night, just the origin of crypto, and I was thinking, you know, what is the etymology? And I know Kelvin Oberon, he's very good on languages and looking back into like, what did these words really mean? Like, where did they actually come from? Which is a good practice. And so I was looking at crypto or crypt, and they said it came from the Greek kryptos, Kryptos, and kryptos means hidden. And so I think in some ways, again, going back to this question, is Bitcoin good or bad? That's presuming well, that's at one level, right? But there are hidden levels of the purpose of, in my opinion, crypto, what crypto is. You might imagine that it's money, but I've done the descent map and I can see it's about way more than money. It's also about digital governance and cybernetics and signals intelligence and crowdsourcing. And there may very well be many other layers of this crypto thing that I have not yet encountered and I can't even conceptualize because my mind is too little. So the hidden part is, yeah, things are obscured. And sometimes things are hidden right out in the open and sometimes they're hidden in a tricky way. But solving these puzzles, and I think that is maybe something that is part of this quantum processing, is that people are really creative in solving puzzles. And again, because we have this access to the divine, to the field, the quantum field, whatever is engineered that doesn't have that is at a disadvantage. So they'd really like for us to partner with it and get in there so that maybe we can solve some of these puzzles that can't be solved otherwise. And so when I was Googling, the first thing that came up with Kryptos, Kryptos, was a sculpture at the CIA in Langley, Virginia, at the George Bush Center for Intelligence in Langley, and it is called a distributed sculpture by the American artist Jim Sanborn. And so it's actually an environmental installation with these bent copper plates and rocks and plants and different things. But the embedded in the copper plates themselves, it's punched out 4 encrypted messages, 3 of which have evidently been analyzed and figured out. And then the 4th still, I guess, as of Wikipedia, hasn't been figured out. And then there is a 5th puzzle that once you've solved all the 4 encryptions, then there's a one that builds off all 4 together, and then that's the final solution. So I guess that is something that hasn't been done yet. But they've got, so it's 4 copper plates, water, wood, plants, red and green granite, white quartz, and petrified wood. And it is this S-shaped copper screen. And it was installed in 1990. So it's been around for quite a bit of time. And I think if you're someone who does encryption or encrypted puzzles, it's widely known in those spheres. I had never heard of it before, but it has listings and sort of the history of the ones that had gotten solved and this background. And there's also a link to Morse code. And it says the Morse code, it says, I'll read what I guess what's been decoded. E, virtually E. I, E, invisible. And I keep thinking about E being electricity or electromagnetism. Digital, I, interpretit, shadow, forces, I forces, E. And then lucid, I, memory, E. T is your I position, E. SOSRQ. So that's quite cryptic. So yeah, if you guys should definitely go check this out. About, I guess the fourth passage still hasn't been solved, but there's cryptos hidden. So I guess, again, we can't fault people for not getting hidden information. And then the other thing I wanted to put out, which I haven't, it goes towards encryption. Wait a minute. This is the last synchronicity I wanted to mention. So I was looking at Joseph Gonzalez's most recent blog post yesterday after, again, getting done hauling some rocks around my yard. And he's done a lot with fractals and recursion. And then this time it was about, I think you say cymatics, C-Y-M-A-T-I-C-S, or maybe it's kymatics. I'm not sure if it's cymatics or kymatics, so apologies for that. So I was trying to get up to speed because his pieces, they have a lot of math that I can't really grok, but it's important stuff, so I let it sort of wash over me. And I was looking at it as I was preparing to go to a local event that was a gong sound bath, right? Which was all about frequency and cymatics. So there was an interesting synchronicity there. And so I want to mention in terms of the encryption and cryptos is that it does link to acoustics. And early on when I was doing some research, and I think, I'm not sure if Raul was the one who brought this to my attention, but is this place called the Fox Labs. Outside of Chicago, Illinois. And Colonel Fabian, who was one of the first independent private think tanks, like defense interest government think tanks, and he was an eccentric man, and he hired all of his own scientists to do various kinds of research, including into plant genetics and into scoliosis and into this Baconian cipher. And he had a cottage that was remade by Frank Lloyd Wright, and he had a very important Japanese garden. This is the late 19th century, and a windmill and cages with bears in them and maybe monkeys, and there was a lot going on. And essentially the two of the people who are working there were William and Elizabeth Friedman. And William Friedman, he was the plant geneticist, and Elizabeth Friedman was working with this other woman on the Baconian cipher, and they essentially became the premier puzzle solvers and cryptanalysts in the United States in the years leading up to World War I. And William Friedman founded the NSA, and Elizabeth Friedman was working closely behind the scenes with the FBI during Prohibition, tracking down people like Joseph Kennedy and his rum running, like the distillery people. So that was super interesting. And then this, the estate still exists as a county park, the Fabian Villa, and it's literally like 10 miles from Fermilab, one of the Department of Energy labs on the Fox River, and you can see the the cyclotron there, the circle. So that's a pretty interesting coincidence. And Colonel Fabian, he focused on acoustical instruments and tuning forks. And so he worked with Wallace Clement Sabine in 1918, and they developed this acoustical laboratory for industrial applications and soundproofing, but also made these tuning forks, which are still in production. The Riverbank Labs tuning forks you can still buy them, and they're very important for industry purposes. But of course, there's a lot of health therapeutic pieces as well. And so I think it was really interesting that what Joseph was promoting in his, or talking about, unpacking in his blog post, was this idea of cymatics and frequency and molecules and accessing quantum reality. And I keep going back to what was going on at Riverbank Labs, right? And it's still there. It still exists, that you could still buy their tuning forks. And how does this acoustic standing wave aspect factor into how we are navigating today's reality with Web3? Super interesting. So there's George Fabian, his estate in Geneva, Illinois, of course, right? And he has the Dutch windmill. I mean, it's totally archetypal, like Don Quixote-esque. And here, let me just show you. So this is Joseph's 2 blog posts that you might want to look at. The cymatic patterns of consciousness and visualizing this with math, because Joseph's very good at making mathematical simulations. So he goes through a lot of really technical things, but then he's got these different frequencies, including here's one with carbon, and they're beautiful patterns, almost like kaleidoscopic patterns. And this is what I keep thinking about, again, with Julian Gresher and Qigong and energy flows, and then Gurdjieff and the group dance movements. And then again, Qigong, and often that's practiced in groups, and Tai Chi is moving energy in space. And one of the things that Emily Moyer, I think, has been working through with some groups is this idea of molecular structure and what's his face? The guy who was working with the light, Walter Russell, I think, Walter Russell, and his ideas about chemicals, and that maybe there's some aspect of chemicals that they're not how we understand them to be. And I think this might sort of bump up against what Joseph's talking about, is the field and resonance. And so maybe things come into manifestation under certain kinds of conditions. And that, again, if we are being managed through consciousness, like, how does it all connect? Like, are we making our own reality? And then if we're making our own reality, what reality are we building? Especially if we're doom scrolling the internet a lot. I don't know. I found it just much nicer to be outside and watching the cardinals and the juncos, the little winter birds coming. But I guess we can't do that all the time. But I'm just trying to figure out how this operating system works. So definitely, even if you don't fully understand it, these images that Joseph has created are quite beautiful. And thinking about, like, wow, there's a lot that we just don't know about how all of this stuff works. And it involves history and knowledges that we just don't have access to yet. And so we should just be mindful of being put by the feed into states of anxiety so that we're operating at our sort of biosurvival state level, and we're not thinking about bigger things. Because I think once we think about the bigger things, maybe it opens up some more opportunities. So this is a little bit of a to be continued. I was out pruning my shrub. So I have this, I don't really have trees in my yard, which I love trees, but I also like to garden. So it's nice to have the sun, and my neighbors have trees, so I can enjoy their trees. But the one bit of shrubbery that I do have is was a hedge along the back fence line, the neighbor's fence line. And when I bought the property, I didn't appreciate that the hedge was actually like 8 crepe myrtle trees. And crepe myrtles are ubiquitous throughout the South. And evidently these shrubs/trees, every few years, the owners would cut them to the ground. And the root systems of crepe myrtles are such that they would sprout back up. But when you have that much sprouting, it's all of these suckers, and they're competing against each other, and they're all very thin. And ultimately, it's just like a wall. It just looks like a messy thing, which I don't really mind it looking messy. But there's something called this kind of scale, which is a little white critter. It looks like dust or messy stuff. It doesn't really move around, and it gloms on to the bark, and it sucks the sap. And then when it sucks the sap off of the bark of the crepe myrtles, then the aphids come, and then the aphids glom on to that. And then the aphids secrete sweet stuff that then instantiates a fungus. So there's like a triple whammy going on with these messy bushes. And then the things grow up underneath it. You can't really mow the grass. You can't mulch or garden around it. And then you've got a crazy invasive Japanese honeysuckle climbing up in it. And you've got English ivy climbing over the bottom. And then you've got some poison ivy popping up here and there. And I just had to attend to it, right? And then the other day, I ended up I went to Lowe's to get some composted manure, and they had on a clearance shelf the last rose bush of the season. And I'm not a huge rose person, but I felt bad for it. It was the last rose. It was only $6. It was a hybrid tea rose. So I took the rose back, but it had been messed with over time, and it was like in all bad shape. And so it was like trimming and pruning it. And as I've been doing this yard work, and for me, it feels a bit meditative. I mean, not just for me, I'm sure, but your mind can wander. And when my mind wanders, it's like the collective unconscious, right? It's thinking over things, maybe not in a really intentional way. And for me, I get some interesting ideas. And so every hour or so, I pause and I run back in and I write things down on these little pieces of paper that I want to talk about. And so, but I've been mulling over this idea of like pruning and guided evolution and agriculture and eugenics, right? Because we were at the Oneida community and they're stirpicults, and they were using, certain reproductive practices to only hatch the most supremely intelligent children, so supposedly, and these utopian cults. And I had done a whole series a while back on the Human Betterment Foundation, which was the West Coast equivalent of Cold Spring Harbor Labs, which was a center of eugenics. And, all of these important people who are connected to that eugenics project, including the David Starr Jordan, who was the first president of Stanford University. And then later, Lewis Terman, Lewisterman. And Lewis Terman was a pioneer educational psychologist who was also part of the Human Betterment Foundation. And he was interested in the genetics of genius. And I think involved in like the Stanford Binet IQ tests and the military testing for intelligence. And then later, Lewis's son, I think Frank Terman, I can't read my head right. Frederick Terman. He was the dean of the engineering school at Stanford, and he essentially became the father of Silicon Valley. And so if you think through this trajectory of optimization and eugenics and Stanford again, sort of pulling sort of the test bed for Laura Arrillaga Andresen and her development of social impact finance. And then you've got the affiliation with Stanford Research Institutes, SRI, and their work in remote viewing and other kinds of extra sensing techniques and that sort of thing. And you think about eugenics and where things are going with the quantum computing. And to me, like, I just have a lot of questions because I love gardening, right? And previously in the talk that, earlier this morning, I'm kind of grappling with, like, I don't know, is this intelligence that we're working with, is it a parasite? Is it a parasitic relationship in which we're under this thing? Is it supposed to be a symbiotic relationship in which we're peers and we're going back and forth? And I don't know. And I think of agriculture the same way, or gardening of the same way. If I didn't go in and try to restructure these crepe myrtles, right? They were just this messy, diseased pile. And they might have like limped along for another 10 years as just a giant armature for honeysuckle and weed trees, and just creating this like complex system, right? It would be its own complex emergent system. And I wanted to put some order to it. So does that make me a eugenicist? Like, I have a fitness landscape. I have an idea of what I'd like to see back there. It would be, crepe myrtle, multi-trunk crepe myrtles that are mature enough to have some nice bark, and then some good mulch underneath, and then a few maybe native shade perennials. Like, that's my optimization landscape. So next spring, when I go out there and I look under the, eye up the mulch under the crepe myrtle because I'm going to mulch a bunch of the leaves and put them there to give it a boost, to clean off the scale and give it a fresh start and keep an eye on things better. But that's my fitness landscape. And then is that the fitness landscape of the crepe myrtles? Maybe they want to be part of like an armature for the honeysuckle. I don't know. Like, how do we have this interface with these other intelligences, and what is our role in this? And it's a communication, right? It's sort of a dance back and forth. The gardening is a dance back and forth. And then there's Western gardening, but then I know these days there's a lot of leaning into indigenous wisdom, right? But as a cultural landscape historian, it's important to realize that indigenous practices, they were really good at agriculture too. And you can say that they were better at working with the landscape than having giant industrial scale monocrop cultures, but they too were cultivating, right? They were doing controlled burns in the forest to create places for prey animals and things like that. Interrupted by a bit of a phone conversation. But yeah, so indigenous wisdom was also a cultivation. It wasn't like they were just sitting around and waiting for the garden, fruit and things to pop up. They were cultivating as well. So it goes way back, agriculture and hybridization and eugenics. Again, William Friedman down at Fabian Labs, Riverbanks Labs, was working in plant genetics. And so this was all optimization. But again, to what end? And I just think of that comes into my head as I'm pruning the rose bush, or, to a certain form that I want. Am I the instigator of the protocol of the rose bush? The same with the crepe myrtles. I'm doing it for your own good. And of course, a lot of the creation of the global brain or the Gaia fascia is connected to, it's for your own good. You don't know how to take care of the collective. So we need to enact these logic gates on you. And then we need to use the collective wisdom and the access to the unconscious to optimize your human potential, right? And ascend or do, become more godly or whatever. And I will say, I know this is a bit all over the place, but the first round of Trump, at the time, there was all of the hysteria around the Christian conservatives and Trump, which is sort of strange bedfellows, really. But there was this angle of muscular Christianity there were images like memes with Trump in the Oval Office with like a muscular Christ behind him. And this muscular Christianity, I think, definitely does connect into the early 20th century, strong mind, strong morals, strong bodies, and the whole fascia and the wellness and the personal optimization as a religious project is really kind of interesting to think about. So just think about Trump and Bobby and wellness and muscular Christianity and how that works in with the quantum biology sensing system with the moral economy. So that all feels really connected. And again, the YMCA is deeply involved in the out of school time learning and badging program. And again, health and fitness had a group of people recently in Hot Springs where I guess the local Medicare group was pulling back from subsidizing the silver sneakers. And I was like, hey guys, just wait. This is problem, reaction, solution. Eventually, you have Pierre Omidyar backing your wellness behaviors with tokens, and it's all going to be coming full circle, but no one knows about that game. Okay, so just finishing off. So I come back in after thinking, wow, I need to talk about crepe myrtles and like my conundrum about gardening, because I love gardening, right? I like to have a vision. And then again, you work with the landscape. You might have an idea about something, but it's not happy there. It doesn't want to be there. And something else is happy there. And so it's trial and error, right? You can't dominate the landscape, but you have to work with it. And in fact, one of the garden beds I was doing the last couple days, it's up against this really ugly expanse of white PVC siding, which it's just not my thing, but I don't have the money to change it all. So I'm like, oh, I can grow something tall like hollyhocks up against the siding so you won't notice how much this giant expanse of PVC white siding is there. And this particular area, my backyard is slightly sloped and there's very clay soil and there's a downspout. And so we had these big rains and there was all this water and it wasn't really flooding my basement or anything, but I was like, I want to get this more away, like dispersed so it's not ponding. And so I ended up building, like using these old scalloped cement blocks and my rocks that I found to make a swale, to make it a little more attractive. And so I'm working with the flow, right? You see what the local conditions are and you try to work with it. And then the next big storm, I'll go out and see if that part's working. And if it's not, then I have to readjust, right? But it is this back and forth. So anyway, so I come in, I'm like, I need to talk about the crepe myrtles and the honeysuckle and whether I'm being a good person for clearing this out and making, like, choosing, right? I'm playing God. Like, this stock goes, this stock stays, because I'm trying to get it around 9 to 11 stocks per, because there's like 80 in each one. And I'm picking and choosing. And that feels also like playing God. And is that the right thing? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So I come back in and then I check my email, and Steffers, who has sent all of this really good information on Helding at Zurich, who's working on exascale complexity. She's found, because I said, hey, I need to do a little talk about Bitcoin and how this all works in the global brain. And she finds a paper of his from 2016 that he's a co-author on about using social Bitcoin to create a multidimensional financial system. Right? Social Bitcoin. And that's, again, is exactly what we're saying. And that was 2016. And he's probably doing the research. His slide deck, his earlier talks were from 2014. So we're 10 years out from this. Now, which influencers online who are scaring you about whatever financial choices you're making are also talking about exascale complexity? I don't think that many, but a lot of these folks who were pitching the financial fear porn were also pitching the quantum blockchain financial system. And I would say just consider how this fits into quantum biology and interdimensionality and finance as a communication signal, because I think it's very connected. And so I replied to the email because last night I was looking at the portable door, and I'm trying to think where else. I can't remember how it came up from the portable door, but I was looking at the financial cryptography, and I was revisiting Ian Grigg's weird pressed flower lamination alternative currency, which kind of bumps up against Charles Eisenstein's, cello and Sepkamvar and money backed by the things you love, right? And this laminated flower currency, which felt very occult, with the guy from Monochrome in Amstetten, Austria. And they're in this dark pub, and they're talking about their, how they've dried their flowers from the spring, and it's the fall, and now they're laminating them. And in the background, they're talking about this article from Die Zeit, a German newspaper, about the Templeton Foundation. And it's kind of a critique about the hold that the Templeton Foundation, and they're interested in spirituality and science and intelligent design, has on the physics community, because they have very deep pockets and they're funding a ton of physics research. And of course, John Templeton, mutual fund, right? Conshohocken, Pennsylvania. I did a whole talk about the Templeton Foundation. And then in the 80s, he gives up his U.S. citizenship, moves to the Bahamas, becomes a British citizen, and is later knighted by the Queen for his service in mutual funds. And again, that's an interdimensional quantum communication system. And so you think about how all of this goes, that the article was called Money Will Teach You How to Pray. And if again, Ian Grigg, a pioneer financial cryptographer, and this guy who's doing like art films, including films about acoustics and the masking threshold, independent film, and this other guy who was working on social gaming with Google and phone-based gaming, and then they're talking about laminated currency systems, and they're talking about, again, interdimensionality, a multidimensional financial system. And then you've got all of the fear porn about they're gonna turn you into puppets and slaves and do all this, put you in camps and take all your money. And we need a quantum financial system, right? Quantum, right? Which would work the quantum biology, should all be on blockchain, but it's going to be the good kind, right? You should join this. But I'm saying, have you read the terms and conditions? Do you know what game you're entering? Because I don't think most people have any clue about any of this. So if you sign up for the quantum financial system, you may not realize that you're doing this interdimensional psychic and computer, but that seems to be, you're going to be a node sending out signals in that larger system. So I noticed in the clip of Ian Grigg in this dark pub in Amstetten, Austria, that he's got a shirt that has this prominent logo on it, and it says IBUC. I'm like, what is IBUC? And so I'm looking up IBUC, and it's the Internet Bearer Underwriting Corporation that was formed in the late 1990s by this guy, Robert Hettinga, who was developing this idea of digital bearer securities and digital bearer settlements, and essentially because moving to a world where there was no cost in transactions, that you could move to tokenizing everything, and that everything could be an immediate token exchange, and that, you know, it would be the changing of all of the banks and all of the transaction systems and all of how we understand finance. And he called it the geodesic market. And then sort of Ian Grigg was in the mix there. So I just want to say, I know this is a bit scattered, and consider this maybe just open-ended notes, but we have to understand cyber-physical systems, how we interact with sensors, how our phone is our sensor, how telehealth and wellness is the way of integrating the wearables and the quantified self into our biology, into our consciousness, and into our heart field, and into getting everyone entrained, setting up the nodes in the massive parallel processing system, and then optimizing towards certain things. And then that's for me where the gardening comes in, because am I an evil gardener? An evil genius gardener, like murdering half the crepe myrtles? Or am I don't know. Or am I being the benevolent creator of 1, 2, 3 Marigold Circle backyard world, and I'm grooming it to be just so? And then am I creating my own protocol layer of how I imagine my backyard would be, that I would have the container gardens here, and then I would have the fig trees over here, and the hedge crepe myrtle, but not scraggly. I would have elegant wispy ones, and it's all my vision, and I'm making the vision. So again, is this my consciousness building this? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Is asking if it's good or bad even the proper question? I don't know, but I think there are many things that, in order for us to kind of grok the bigger game, we need to understand things like the quantum financial system being a multidimensional social infrastructure connected to quantum physics and all the stuff that Joseph has been writing about quantum realism, and how these tokens are linked to artifacts in the real world, and the entanglements of tokens as representations, and how they represent the real thing, and the interdimensionality and the exchange of tokens and the movement of tokens through flow state and swarming and crowdsourcing. And you know, I just find the whole thing kind of fascinating. If we can stop being terrified and just say, hey, there's stuff we don't get. There's stuff we don't get yet. I might not ever get it. I have a pretty big base of information to work from, and there's at this point there's just more and more loose ends going out everywhere, which is why I have to go out in the backyard and prune bushes and think about things. But in closing, I will just mention, because you know, Sean has some property. Actually, Sean and Steffers both have their own different kinds of gardens, and you know, I was talking about, because I haven't had land. I mean, I only have like 0.21 acres, but it's a bit of land, right, to be on and to interact with. And I said, going outside is like being in your own zone and doing this work with your body, because it's, again, the mind is floating free as the body is doing the work. And I imagine maybe for some people, it's the same as like extreme sports or whatever. Like you're using your body in one way, so your mind is freed up to go to other places. And this idea of work-based meditation is something I came across in a book. It was about the history of Zen in America. And it was featuring the origins of Zen practice, and through the lens of like 5 different major practitioners. And one of the chapters was on this guy, Bernie Glassman, that I was fascinated with, because Bernie Glassman is a super smart math guy who was trained at UCLA, became a Zen Buddhist, and then brought that back to New York City and was sort of a centerpiece in the Buddhist construct, and set up the first benefit corporation, which was a bakery where they kind of cultivated ex-felons to carry around bags of flour to make fancy brownies for Ben and Jerry's and Whole Foods. And this was like the main case study for the benefit corporation. But then Bernie, being the Zen Buddhist mandala, contemplative prayer, homeless management thing, was doing mixed use development, real estate, affordable housing, nursery schools, like all of the social service infrastructure, workforce training that would be all then tokenized. And I found that pretty fascinating, because what Glassman was saying was that you don't need to go sit in a beautiful temple with, pristine flower arrangements and things to be in this Zen meditative state. You can do it through work. And I think this same approach applies to different, because they had relationships to these different monasteries, and it applied to that as well, like the monastic traditions of silence and contemplative prayer, and then also often farming or food work. And so I was mentioning this to Sean and Steffers, and Sean sort of chimed in about the idea of like we had talked about farmers markets before, and like farmers markets is this, if we're thinking about live action role play, like performance space of local food and soil, and right, like what is the intelligence behind this? Is this the interdimensional biofilm? I know some people don't like to think about it like that, but is it this other kind of intelligence, right? And so I was thinking about that, and and then Sean said, yeah, it's interesting, the interconnection. I said, we have a nice farmer's market in Hot Springs. And he said, well, does yours have SNAP benefits? Because the farmer's markets I participated in Washington, they would double up to a certain amount per month people's food assistance to shop at the farmer's market. And I said, I hadn't looked. So I go to the Hot Springs farmer's market, and yes, there is a whole SNAP program. And of course, SNAP was something they wanted to put on blockchain and incentivize good eating behaviors, right? Which this would be an incentive, right? You double your points if you go to the farmer's market and you eat locally grown food, even though a lot of the stuff at the farmer's market is arts and crafts and collectibles, but not actually food these days. And I keep thinking about that in terms of artifacts, communication artifacts. But so I'm looking it up, and yeah, we do have it. And how it works is, instead of having the incentive within a digital card, I guess you would go to a point of sale terminal and you would tell them how much you want to spend. Like, I want $20, and they would give you $40 in Snap coins. And in the image of the Snap coin, I don't know if they're literally physical coins. Like, I don't know. It seems like they might be physical tokens. That it's like a copper coin token, and the logo on it had sort of a bag of groceries, maybe with a bread sticking out. But on one hand, it was a carton of eggs, but the shape of the carton of eggs was totally a bee. It was totally a Bitcoin. And I sent this to them. I texted them the image. I said, can you see? Is that carton of eggs? Is that not the Bitcoin logo? Because it pretty much evokes the Bitcoin logo to me. And Sean agreed. He's like, yeah, it actually does look like the Bitcoin logo. And then I thought, that's really perfect when we're thinking about eggs and embryogenesis and the morphic field and fascia and bioelectricity, that you would symbolize embryogenesis with Bitcoin and the energetic field. I mean, it's like a triple play of like visual and words and concepts. And probably I'm one of the few people with an operating system that would key in that, hey, I think that I see what you did there. Funny, playful universe. I think that's what you're up to. So again, thinking about Mike 11, and it's Richard A. Watson, and embryology and consciousness and morphic fields and optimization of systems, because that feels like what's going on with these geodesic markets and social Bitcoin and digital democracy. And it goes back to the Society of Psychical Research. But to what end, right? Is it collaborative? I mean, they're going to tell you it's collaborative. They're totally going to tell you it's collaborative. Like the person who emailed me about investing in the Bitcoin would say, oh yeah, no, it's totally collaborative. It's commenting, right? Like, we're doing the good thing. It's whatever, the coherent story, that's what it's going to be. They're the good gardener, right? They're like Allison the gardener. They're the good. And it's not parasitic, right? It's not a parasitic thing. But is it, right? Because I still have questions. You know, I have questions about those derivative securities and toddlers in Head Start and the surveillance play tables. And I have questions about how you're going to, who gets to set the menu of this collective game that we're playing. And I have a lot of questions. And what's frustrating is I feel like and maybe it's just supposed to be this way, but are we going to be able to get up to speed enough to have informed consent? That's what I keep saying, informed consent, guide rails, different things. But through knowledge management or how our mind works or doesn't work or how the coherent story works, right? This person had bought Bitcoin and needed a story that made that good. Like that's a good decision. So the coherent story, the decision, the action was already taken, and then the backstory has to backfill that that's good. And I'm not saying it's bad, I just don't know. But our brains, we act and then we tell stories that make the actions that we made make sense. And that's part of the free energy principle and the active inference. And Yo Shabak talking about us being coherence engines. We do things and then we tell stories that make the things that we did make sense, which is the inversion, which is again back to the White Queen and Alice Through the Looking Glass, is like time gets inverted. We do the things and then we tell the stories that the things we do make sense. And so are we ever going to, like in this continuum, which I don't know is linear, I think is really non-linear or spiraling, going to get to the part that we can have informed consent? That a large consensus of people have enough knowledge to say, yeah, I'm down with that. Like I would totally use Snapcoin, you know, to optimize my eating behaviors and for the collective good. And I think, yeah, and sure, it's fine if BlackRock makes bank off of that. Like I'm okay with that as long as I'm healthy and I have enough. That's maybe we'll get to that point, but I'm increasingly skeptical about that because, again, even people that I've been collaborating with for a really long time, like they're not there. And maybe I'm going in the wrong direction. It's possible I'm going in the wrong direction. I don't know, but I'm still thinking a lot, and the field still seems to be talking to me a lot through poison ivy and honeysuckle and scale. So I will just leave you with that thought that, yeah, Hellbing and multidimensional financial systems, the quantum blockchain, geodesic markets, financial cryptography, communication, money will teach you how to pray, and the Templetons. Of course, Templeton is always hanging out with Fetzer, so they're money anyway. All right, until next time. Okay, this is a totally grab bag presentation, but I just finished pruning back my second crepe myrtle shrub / tree, and I'm going to go get some compost next. But I had some thoughts, and I wanted to make sure that I sort of recorded them so they didn't get lost to the wind. And so here are some of my thoughts. So first, I've mentioned before about Itzhak Bentov's Stalking the Wild Pendulum, which I think is a really important book. It was written in the 70s, and then he died shortly after in a plane crash. And essentially one of the things Bentov said, and I can't find it exactly in this book, but he was an engineer. He was involved in Israel's rocket program, and but he had a meditative practice. And what he was trying to do was sort of talk about holographic reality and his ideas, his epiphanies that he had received sort of in meditation. And one of the things that really struck me about the book is he said, and this seems to resonate, this resonates with me, is the idea that the universe, God, the divine, speaks to you when you're prepared to listen in a way that's suitable to how you can hear it. And we all have different operating systems. So he was an engineer, and he thought like an engineer. So this book is actually quite interesting in that it's metaphysical, but it's written from the standpoint of an engineer. And so he would have these epiphanies they would be like more like engineering diagrams. And I have a sense, if you look at Bantam Joe's writings, like his operating system, I'm not saying is exactly the same, but he accesses these epiphanies through the language of mathematics. and physics. And that is a language that's very foreign to me. But my language is more one of symbolism and landscape and things. So that's how it feels like in nature, the universe speaks to me, is through that language. And one isn't better than the other. They're different. And again, I think it's beautiful that we're all diverse and we have different ways of being a part of this flow of the divine creation. I think it's great. And I think that there is merit in this idea of being engaged in activities, whether they be quiet activities like contemplative meditation, or whether they be activities that you put you in the zone in another way through sports or me through gardening, that we can get out of our daily chatter of our heads and think about bigger things and be open to ideas coming in from the field, from God, however you understand that, and thinking of hopefully capturing those, and a lot of that is also in dreams, symbolic dreaming, and then seeing how they might apply to our lives. And my one caution is sort of a unilateral application of one practice to everybody. And that's why I sort of balk at this idea of the noosphere or the ascension or a one world religion, even if it's your preferred religion, because I don't think it's one size fits all. I think we all have our different access points into that, and it's in the diversity that's beautiful. But I think in some way, the idea of networking us as parallel nodes and parallel processing is part of that, is capturing these epiphanies. And that's something that Steffers had brought to my attention quite a few months ago, maybe at some point at the beginning of this year or last year. We were looking into James Joyce and epiphanies and this idea of creating conducive environments to epiphanies. And so I've been listening to these lectures from the Lindisfarne tapes, which are at the Schumacher Society. Now they're available on archive.org. And there's a whole series, and maybe I've mentioned him before, but Louis Balamuth, and it's Lewis, who was an engineer in ultrasonics, but also very interested in sacred numbers and sacred geometry and sort of esoteric knowledges, and going back to Egypt and other things. And essentially he holds many patents in ultrasonic surgical equipment and dental equipment and things. And, in one of the lectures, he says, I can't really take credit for any of this. It all came sort of through me, these ideas. It wasn't because I was super smart or thinking about them. They just came and arrived. And so I think these epiphanies also apply to novelists or musicians or it's often talked about. And so if we can get in a position of listening, they're there. And then I guess the question is, as we are moving into this liquid democracy, perpetual sensing, cloud mind, blockchain situation, where every single idea is ticked and noted and put in a digital ledger. So at some point in 20 years, maybe this thought you had is relevant to some other problem on the other side of the universe, and then it gets matched up and you get a micropayment or something. I think it's worth discussing how we feel about that, because I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about this overall protocol layer, but I'm open to talking about it once people get up to speed on what it is we should be looking at. And so the other thing is, in this introduction to Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Bentov is talking about ignorance, and sort of the more you know, the more questions you have and the more ignorant you get. And so, I will admit, I think I was pretty sharp with the person who had this question about wanting to know why I was was Bitcoin bad, and why was I thinking that? And my gut reaction is just, I've said a lot of how I think about it. You have to do your own thinking. And I don't want to be held up as an expert. That's why I've never monetized my content, because I don't want you to think I have the answers. The more I know, the more I don't know. And so I would never want to be held up as oh, Allison knows and she says this. It's more like, Allison's read a lot of things and she has a lot of questions. And this is a question that is also a question I have, or the question that she asks makes me think about this other thing that I have questions about. And it's more percolating up your own thinking rather than sign up, I'm going to tell you what fund to invest in, or sign up, I'm going to tell you who's the bad guy. At this point in the process, if you follow me, you know that's not how I do things. And so I think this, I want to just read these 2 paragraphs from Bentov because I think it speaks to this. And if we're doing our process of becoming, on the one hand, it's about organizing information. He talks about like being information organizers and then gifting the information we've organized and the stories we've organized it with to the field, to God, to the Akashic records, what have you. But then almost as we're building stories, we're also unraveling old stories behind us. And a lot of people can't unravel those old stories. And I'm not saying that I'm somehow better because I unravel the stories, but I was talking with a friend lately about, we were just reminiscing that it feels very isolating, you know, and I've talked about this before, and because even people who were with us to a point, like, couldn't keep proceeding, and just thinking about like why we are where we are and how we've gotten here and how it's like we value each other's friendship because there's not that many of us who are at this particular point on the road. And we sort of likened it to like a closet, like decluttering. And that some of us are willing to see new things and say, you know, the me 10 years ago totally saw the logic in that. But the me now has a lot of questions, and I'm willing to both respect that person and care for that person because they were doing the best they knew with what they knew then. But it's something much bigger. And so, you know, I can take that garment off and put it in the giveaway pile and I'd be okay with that, right? And even though sometimes it's wistful because, you know, like the front, we were using the metaphor and we're like, oh, but that looks so good on you, right? That look looks so good on you. Or that color, yeah, that purple was really good. But sometimes we have to just move on and let it go. And that's the process of becoming, which I have not started this, but I am very intrigued by Albert North Whitehead. And I think David Segal has been looking into him, and then David Segal is sort of overlapped with Michael Levin and the active inference crowd, and this idea of metaphysics and becoming. The becoming is, you know, changing out your closet and maybe decluttering or adding new things. And, you know, one of the things that was really hard for me when my marriage ended, or leading up, and I didn't realize how imminent was that my marriage was going to be ending, but my ex-husband kept saying, you've changed. And I kept thinking, well, yeah, I'm 55 years old. Like, did you think I was going to be the same person I was when I was 21? Like, you do get new information and you change. Like, I wasn't looking to declutter my closet of my husband and child. I wasn't looking, I thought we could kind of change together, but I guess it's more complicated that the becoming part. But I don't think we want to stop becoming and then somehow get cryogenically frozen to where we were when we got our first job or something like that. Like, that would be really stagnant. Although I guess some people do that, and I couldn't do that. So this process in reality is very intriguing to me. And then Whitehead had another book of lectures on symbolism, which is, again, more my language, although it's mathy. And even David Segal says, like, I don't recommend trying to read this alone because you'll get lost forever and never make your way out. And so when I ordered it, I also ordered a glossary that went along with it. So I think this idea of becoming and unbecoming, right? And it's a cycle. And again, that's why I kind of push back against any of the ascension apocalypse narratives, because I feel like they're very directed linearly. And I think wherever we are, we're at cycles of knitting together and then coming apart, and then knitting together and coming apart. And then maybe when we get to the older age where we're very wise, the knitting and the unraveling will come together in a larger tapestry that we can comprehend better. We'll have enough distance on it, but I'm not quite there yet. Okay, so I'm going to read this little bit from Bentov about being ignorant. And again, pardon my sharp reply when I was sort of insisting that people do their own thinking. It's because I don't know where you are in the elephant. I don't know how your operating system works. I don't know what you care about. I don't know what triggers you. I can't give you the right answer, because the more I've walked this road, the more I know that I don't know, and I'm not in a position of really advising anybody else. But what I can do is say, this is where I am now, and I'm looking around, and this is what I see. And sometimes I find ideas or books or lenses that I find useful to me in this moment, and then I'm sharing them back with you because maybe you will find them useful. Or maybe you're like, that totally doesn't fit me. I don't think that way. And that's fine, because at the end of the day, I really do want for people to be able to be diverse and think about things in a different way, even though there's the inner part of me that would really like for people to better understand Web3 and second order cybernetics and digital governance. But I have to be okay with the fact that whatever, this little outlier pocket that I'm in is the one that's in this part of the elephant, and it's definitely on the margins. So, okay, so the introduction to Stalking the Wild Pendulum. This book is the result of some living room discussions that I had with friends over a period of time. They became more and more elaborate as topics were added to the original discussions, and eventually my friends felt that presenting these ideas to a broader audience would be in order. Finally, I gave in to the well-intentioned nagging of my friends and put down some of these ideas on paper. As I sat down to write, I wondered whether it was the right time to do so. The accumulation of knowledge is a continuous process, and it is difficult to say at what point one should say, stop here, and write down whatever information has accumulated up to now. And so again, this is not Bentov, but this is just me. This is why this is such a scattered bit, because sometimes I feel like I want to just throw out a bunch of puzzle pieces on the table, so maybe I'll remember them later. And then maybe you'll see one of these particular pieces that applies to you that you find helpful. So I don't want to wait till the end where I have the answer and it's all polished, because part of it is the process of becoming. And sometimes the process of becoming is messy. And so sometimes the process of becoming just looks like me looking more and more bedraggled as I do my yard work, coming in and saying, but wait, there's more. Okay, so back to Bentov. I have decided to start writing at my present level of ignorance simply because the circumstances force me to do so. It is certain that I could describe many things better and add many new ideas if I were to start this book 2 or 3 years from now. However, I would still face the same situation because one's level of ignorance increases exponentially with accumulated knowledge. For example, no, I want to read that again. That's a really good quote. It is certain that I could describe many things better and add many new ideas if I were to start this book 2 or 3 years from now. However, I would still face the same situation because one's level of ignorance increases exponentially with accumulated knowledge. That's a good one. For example, when one acquires a bit of new information, there are many new questions that are generated by it, and each new piece of information breeds 5 or 10 new questions, and these questions pile up at a faster rate than does the accumulated information. The more one knows, therefore, the greater his level of ignorance, and this effect does seem to justify my decision to publish this information now. So, yay, Itzhak. I think that's a really good analysis, and that's why you're being treated to this messy presentation. Oh, the other thing is, so when we were talking about phones and sensors and Bitcoin as a social financial system and all of that, like I'm just revisiting for people who forgot World Sensorium and Oliver Reiser. So this is available as a reprint on Amazon. And yeah, 1946, the phones as us being distributed sensors, the tentacles of the octopus, whatever is the octopus head. It started back, well, probably earlier than Oliver Reiser, but definitely it was in full swing in 1946. And okay, and so the last thing I want to mention before I go out and get my compost, I've mentioned Tchaikovsky a bunch, Children of Ruin. And again, I feel like the universe speaks to me sometimes in nature, sometimes in books I read, sometimes in conversations, things people send my way. And sometimes they stack together in like units, just like the snap and the egg carton and the Bitcoin and the woman asking about Bitcoin and then the social Bitcoin currency, all like happening in this space. And, Joseph and his cymatics blog posts in quantum consciousness, and then going to the Gong presentation and then triggering these ideas about Riverbank Labs and acoustics. And again, a lot of the acoustic stuff also links back to the Bentov. So they're like these little packet units that said, oh, here's a thing that all goes together. So so in this, one of the books that I has really informed my thinking a lot, and it's fiction. It's a fictional book, but I think it opens the door into possibilities. And the possibilities are, would we recognize a superintelligence if it were to show up in our lives? And I would say our capacity for understanding what intelligence is constrained. And there are many things that may be this giant, enormous intelligence that we would not recognize as such. And to think that humans are at the top of the food chain, I think is inaccurate. We're pretty good, but we don't know all of the things. And to presume, again, Levin talks about time scales. We're really good at identifying things in a certain set of parameters, right? A certain kind of light frequencies, a certain kind of sound frequencies, a certain kind of time frame. But things that move really fast or really slow, we miss out because we're not attuned to that. And so the Tchaikovsky book, he's exploring different kinds of intelligences as represented in different kinds of creatures. And one of the characters in Children of Ruin is essentially, it is kind of like a biofilm. It's like a microbial network, and you could imagine it as being part of the body snatchers. But it's not, it essentially gets into people and sort of freezes them where they are, but it doesn't kill them. It maybe turns them kind of zombie-like, but not to control them. Essentially, they're after novelty. They're after these novel experiences of trying to get in and look out the eyes of different living organisms and then absorb the information that is within the armature of that biological structure. And it's not to kill it, or it's not to be mean or to turn it into a walking around robot. It's simply to get the information. It's voracious for information, which again, I can kind of commiserate with, because I myself love novelty and information. So there's like a little bit of a soft spot in my heart for the we of the Children of Ruin. But eventually the AI has to work it out with this. But I want to read, this is page 244 of this edition of Children of Ruin, the soft cover. And it's just the voice of the we. And I think it's useful to keep a placeholder out there of like, could this be the thing that we're engaging with? And I had sent Sean some pictures from the summer of 2020 when I went out to Cheyenne River Reservation and I was trying to make a garden on the prairie, with no irrigation, which was kind of a dumb plan. But I think it was in the cards for how my version of the video game was working out. And part of it, I had a friend who worked at the farm at Bartram's Garden, and he had recommended a book about Korean natural farming. And I was really fascinated. And this idea is like you kind of create you create a lure for local microbial systems that are then fermented in different ways and processed. And then you use it to either incorporate it into soil or mix it into water and use it as a foliar spray. So you cook organic brown rice in a certain way, and you put it in a cedar box in leaf litter. And then you wait, and it inoculates itself, and it grows into this crazy microbial web. And then you extract that, and you mix it in with brown sugar in a crock, and then it's supposed to ferment. And I didn't get to this point, but then you take the fermented process and you mix it into like oat bran, and then then I think at that point you can mix it into the soil or make a spray out of it. But I was just fascinated by this cedar box with this amazing rice microbial thing. And so when I read the we, I sort of think about this we. And in this particular circumstance, I was on the plains of South Dakota, and it was very windy, and there were not a lot of trees, but this particular area that I was in was along the Moreau River, and there were these beautiful, not giant, but quite old cottonwood trees. And you're supposed to put it in leaf litter. That's the idea, but I couldn't find any because all the leaves would blow away. And so there really weren't leaves to be had. But then one day we went to an area that was in a floodplain along the river. And so the leaves that had dropped had gotten covered with a bit of silt, enough to hold them down. And so I found this beautiful place with this three cottonwood trunks coming together. It was just exactly the size of the box. And so I put the box there, and I didn't know what would happen. I really didn't. and it was kind of hard to get to. It was back along the river, and you had to bushwhack through like a bunch of weeds and poison ivy and milkweed and stuff. And we got back there, and the day I went to reclaim it, there were like bald eagles flying over, and it was super cool the way this box was. So when I do say my placeholder is the interdimensional biofilm, like I kind of mean it, because I do feel like this quorum sensing or this intelligence at this tiny scale, maybe, I mean, that's as good of an idea of what's going on as any. So, okay, so this is from Children of Ruin, page 244. We listen. Information on either side of us, the crackling discharge of meaning for generations. We listen. Dying and renewing and feeding, careful not to upset the balance these of we have achieved. The world around us is quiescent now, and we have made our peace with it. And what have we found? We cannot know, but we store and process, construct our theories and our models within the labyrinthine structures of our libraries. Each pattern of information that comes to us is examined and passed on, one side to the other and back. We are constructing a picture of the complexities of this new land. These of we are beginning to understand the existence of an identity. These patterns tell us stories of greater spaces and arrangements of structures beyond. We listen and we learn that this great world we have found is small, that it orbits amongst others, that this assembly of electricity is its own library of concepts utterly alien to us. But we are intrepid and we are inquisitive and we can adapt. We are listening. We are listening about all the places outside this, our new vessel. We are growing. The information feeds us. Processing this new data is turning us into something more than we were, because we must stretch to accept such new ideas. We model the sensory inputs of our vessel, the motor outputs, most of all, the busy transition of information. Such life, such wonder as our vessel talks to itself through us. One generation understands enough. One generation has modeled enough. We know the vessel and the spaces and the other complexities that it talks to itself about. One generation begins to change the information as it passes through us, inserting our own data, modifying its parameters, speaking to it in its own voice. And so it's about this information organizing and information management and this desire to know and to understand. And I think we're all driven for a desire to know and understand, and that's why we tell stories. And the material we use to tell the stories is part of the knowledge management program, right? That Jeremy Pitts and Josiah Ober talk about, that the superorganism runs on knowledge management, because if we were to be presented with all the information, it would be overwhelming, and then we wouldn't know what stories to tell. And I think that's the email that was asking about the Bitcoin was like, tell me your story about Bitcoin, which I think I kind of have been telling for a long time. And I understand that I have so much content out there and it's not well indexed that maybe it's hard to find again how I actually feel about it. But I feel about it a certain way. I still am processing, and as Benthoff says, right, the more you know, the more ignorant you feel and the more questions you have. So, you know, with that, and I was looking around for my Stalking the Wild Pendulum. I have a lot of books that I haven't read yet, and I'd ordered this one, and I haven't opened it yet, but it's called Poesis and Enchantment in Topological Matter. And I'll just read you the back cover. Sha Sin Wei moves fluently between ontological speculation and the pragmatics of designing digital environments. He is equally at home discussing the abstractions of topology and the aesthetics of interactive performance. He embraces the digital while moving beyond its limitations. Poesis and Enchantment in Topological Matters offers us a vision of a world rich in experience and meaning, a common world that we share, as Alfred North Whitehead once put it, a democracy of fellow creatures. And so it's like talking about digital media and landscapes and entanglements and mapping. And I do feel like somehow this goes back to our live action role play in smart environments with artifacts is somehow navigating a labyrinth. And, this goes back to Theseus and the Minotaur and the dandelions. And I do have the dandelions. I didn't get to see them in bloom here this year, but I definitely have dandelion rosettes popping up in my garden, and I'm leaving them there. And there's several that are nice and like a foot across, and I'm just waiting for next year. So yes, into the labyrinth we go. And thanks for hanging out with me. Bye.